The cameras were already rolling when Scott Bessent froze. Behind him, the Swedish delegation whispered. The Chinese negotiators didn't blink, and the words Bessent chose next weren't a statement. They were a retreat. "We're still working through the terms," he muttered, stepping back from the podium. But no one missed the truth. Washington had just blinked, because this was never supposed to happen. The White House had spent 3 months projecting strength, laying down hard lines, and warning of 145% tariffs snapping back into place the moment China stepped out of line. But now, at the final moment, the US wasn't pressing forward. It was offering a pause. And the reason? Leverage had flipped. China held it. The US didn't. The contradiction is plain. In May, Trump's administration declared that China's economy was on the brink, that US pressure was crushing their supply chains. But Beijing never conceded. It redirected. Trade with the US fell 21%, but exports to Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa surged. According to data from China's General Administration of Customs, overall exports rose 8.6% in the second quarter. So, while Washington squeezed, China rerouted and made more money doing it. The market didn't wait to respond. On the day Bessent landed in Stockholm, crude oil spiked by over $2 a barrel, while the yuan strengthened. Investors weren't betting on an American victory. They were hedging against a backpedal. Even Bloomberg's tracker showed Chinese equities outperforming U.S. industrials by nearly 7% over the month. Wall Street knew what was coming before Bessent stepped off the plane. Then came the double bind. Just days before the talks, Congress granted the president authority to slap 500% tariffs on Chinese imports tied to sanctioned Russian energy purchases. It was meant to scare Beijing. Instead, it handcuffed the negotiators. The more aggressive the authority appeared, the harder it became to explain why the U.S. was now asking for an extension instead of enforcing it. That's not leverage. That's bluff exposure. Meanwhile, China wasn't bluffing. It had already slashed U.S. LNG purchases to near zero. Reuters confirmed that China imported no U.S. coal, crude, or LNG for a second straight month. In its place, Russia, Qatar, and Brazil. The message to Washington was unmistakable. China can replace you. Can you replace China? That's what makes this next part even more absurd. While Bessent scrambled in Stockholm, Trump's team was finalizing a completely different deal with Europe. The EU, facing its own trade deadline, capitulated. Under the new agreement, European exports to the US, valued at over $300 billion year to date, will face a uniform 15% tariff. That includes German cars, French pharmaceuticals, Italian machine tools. No exceptions, no phase-ins, just pain. But the EU didn't just accept the tariffs, it sweetened the deal by pledging to buy $750 billion worth of American energy, LNG, oil, gas, all at premium US prices. And as if that weren't enough, Brussels added one more chip, a promise to facilitate $600 billion of private sector investment into US manufacturing. Not subsidies, not matched funds, just raw capital outflow. And here's where the contradiction sharpens into irony. Just hours after the agreement was signed, senior EU officials admitted that they can't enforce the $600 billion promise. Brussels has no legal authority to compel private companies to invest abroad. The pledge was, well, symbolic, performative. Yet Washington treated it as binding. And in exchange, Trump dropped the threat of 30% tariffs that had been dangling since March. So the EU gets hit with a 15% tariff and loses capital to US industry. And China, despite resisting every US demand, from rare earth quotas to fentanyl enforcement, gets a fresh extension and avoids escalation. The difference in treatment couldn't be more clear. China was negotiated with. Europe was dictated to. Even inside the EU, cracks are forming. France's prime minister called the deal a dark day for Europe, warning that the continent had accepted structural weakness in exchange for temporary access. Germany, on the other hand, quietly supported it. Their exporters were already reeling, and Berlin calculated that 15% tariffs were better than being locked out altogether. But that logic only holds in the short term. Stellantis has already projected a €1.5 billion loss this year due to the tariff terms. Philips revised its cost forecast up by another €200 million. BASF hinted at plant closures in Belgium. And Europe's energy bills are about to spike. By committing to U.S. energy imports, the EU cuts itself off from Russian supply without securing domestic substitutes. That's not diversification. That's dependence. At the same time, Europe's foreign direct investment has collapsed. According to EY's 2025 Attractiveness Survey, FDI into Germany fell 17% last year. France dropped 14%. The UK fell 13%. And that was before the tariff deal. In contrast, China received $66 billion in new FDI, double that of the UK. So while Europe bleeds capital and locks itself into transatlantic energy flows, China is doubling down on domestic stimulus and international infrastructure. Bessent knows this. That's why he didn't push harder in Stockholm. China's position isn't desperate. It's strategic. They've started to reopen rare earth exports selectively, but they've made no long-term guarantees. They're still buying Russian oil, and they haven't agreed to any fentanyl conditions. Trump's 20% levy from the first quarter remains in place, but there's no clear threshold for removal because the U.S. hasn't defined what compliance looks like. And yet, the talks continue because Washington can't afford collapse, not during an election cycle, not with consumer inflation still lurking. According to Wells Fargo, import prices on Chinese goods like appliances and toys have already risen 6.1% year over year. General Motors reported a $1.1 billion cost impact directly tied to tariffs. And Deutsche Bank notes that U.S. consumers are bearing over 80% of the tariff burden, not foreign suppliers. Let's pause, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. The United States claimed it was holding the line, demanding better trade terms, restoring manufacturing, reshoring industry. But now it's the one pleading for a delay. It's the one watching its allies pay inflated costs to subsidize American infrastructure. It's the one asking Beijing not to retaliate. This isn't economic strategy. This is strategic exposure. And it's not ending here. The European Union has already signaled that it may tie future climate votes and defense initiatives to economic reciprocity. Japan, having signed a similar $550 billion investment pledge, has begun backpedaling, and developing nations are watching. If alignment with Washington means permanent tariffs, forced capital outflows, and energy lock-in, then neutrality starts to look like the smarter bet. Meanwhile, China continues to exploit the fractures. At the BRICS Energy Forum last week, Beijing offered discounted rare earths to Brazil and South Africa in exchange for chip supply access. In Latin America, it signed a deal to finance rail infrastructure in Argentina using yuan-settled trade. This isn't retreat. It's redirection. The United States is imposing tariffs to protect sovereignty, but in doing so, it's demanding allies surrender theirs. The European Union hands over investment capital. Japan hands over agricultural access. Meanwhile, China, with no compliance, no concessions, walks away with its leverage intact, its exports climbing, and its alliances multiplying. This isn't a negotiation anymore. It's a reckoning. The United States has rewritten the rules of trade to extract capital from friends and stall escalation with rivals. And it's now locked in a cycle it can't escape. If it raises tariffs, inflation spikes. If it lowers them, it loses face. If it demands compliance, it gets defiance. If it offers relief, it gets dependence. Scott Bessent didn't cave because he wanted to. He caved because there was no other move left. The game board was already tilted. The European Union folded under pressure. China held its position. And now the next phase begins. Not of tariffs, but of alignment. Of which countries will restructure their economies to suit America's. And which ones will refuse. Because this was never about trade. It was about control. And right now, the center of gravity is shifting. But not in silence. As China continues to expand its influence through trade corridors and BRICS infrastructure, Washington finds itself reacting, not dictating. Just this week, Bloomberg reported that Indonesia is considering adopting a dual invoicing system for exports, settling in yuan and rupees instead of dollars. That alone signals a drift in global trade norms that the United States cannot easily reverse. Meanwhile, the European Union's $600 billion pledge has triggered backlash at home. Critics in Brussels are now questioning whether the promise even meets legal standards under EU competition law. Without official subsidy approval or parliamentary consent, the Commission may have overstepped, and if corporate pledges don't materialize, the bloc risks exposure not just to American tariffs, but internal lawsuits. This compounds a growing problem. European energy-intensive industries are facing a triple blow: high electricity prices, supply uncertainty from United States LNG markets, and now added logistics costs from shifting transatlantic trade rules. The European Steel Association issued a warning this morning. Without clarity on future tariff exposure, investment will stall. Already, Sweden's SSAB has delayed a $1.2 billion facility upgrade. And just as Europe questions the future of its industry, Japan is slowing its own commitments. After pledging $550 billion in United States-bound investment, Tokyo has clarified that less than 20% has been confirmed. The rest is conditional, based on Washington maintaining a non-escalatory posture. In other words, if tariffs rise, the money won't flow. That posture now faces another test. India, long considered a swing state in the global trade order, is reportedly re-evaluating its bilateral framework with the United States. Reuters confirmed Delhi delayed signature on a key digital trade chapter, one that would have locked India into United States-style data restrictions. For Washington, that's a warning flare. Partners are hesitating. The contradiction here is sharp. The United States is deploying tariffs as a tool of dominance, yet simultaneously demanding investment and purchases from the very countries it penalizes. The logic unravels. If you need capital inflows, why coerce your allies into exporting them? If you want price stability, why provoke your cheapest suppliers? Even within the White House, signs of friction are emerging. Two senior trade officials leaked comments to the Financial Times, expressing concern that the EU and China tracks are completely out of sync. One warned that we've squeezed our allies harder than our rivals. Another noted, Beijing is responding to leverage. Brussels is reacting to pressure. But we're creating the same bill for both. What that means, strategically, is that Washington has narrowed its own lanes. Push China harder and supply chains shift. Press Europe harder and investment flees. And all the while, the dollar remains strong, making U.S. exports less competitive. It's a feedback loop with no off-ramp. There's also a legal contradiction brewing. Several EU firms are preparing to challenge the deal in European courts, arguing that the 15% tariff acceptance violates WTO norms unless reciprocated. If that challenge succeeds, Brussels may be forced to renegotiate, or risk triggering a new legal war that undercuts the entire framework. So, what's next? Bessent may have bought time in Stockholm, but he didn't secure clarity. Beijing is still holding off on any fentanyl-related concessions. Rare earths remain uncommitted past the 90-day mark. And there's no resolution on the 20% auto tariff still technically live in the U.S. codebase. In other words, we are still in a phase of suspended escalation. And while Trump may celebrate the illusion of stability, the geopolitical truth is more fragile. The EU, under duress, has surrendered policy space. China, under pressure, has refused to surrender anything, and America, in trying to manage both, is burning its margins in every direction, economically, diplomatically, and politically. Because for all the talk of deals, the reality is that this isn't deal-making, it's demand extraction, it's short-term certainty in exchange for long-term sovereignty. And in that frame, the one who caves isn't just Bessent, it's anyone who accepts terms they can't define or enforce. Which brings us back to that podium in Stockholm, where a Treasury Secretary stepped away without answers, where China remained seated without compromise, and where the global trade system held its breath, waiting to see whether American leverage still meant anything, or whether the age of economic coercion had just entered its final act. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.